I'm Chris McDonough, a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room.
Days to weeks to months to years to ever get there, one step at a time. But now you take an individual who normally, because of their value system or other inhibitions that may have prevented them from even thinking about doing something like that, they get introduced to it, to experiment with it now virtually. And it opens up a world, to me anyway, in my opinion, it opens up a world of potential offenders that may have never offended before against a human being. And we do know that many individuals are satisfied sufficiently with the fantasy alone. But now that they can act it out, or now that they can experiment it, that's not a crime. They can experiment it in the metaverse. That's no crime. But now they go out and experience it, experience a crime, experience all those chemical reactions that they seem to enjoy and are heightened by. And now, of course, the next step is a real person, just like the fantasy.
Yeah, no, the possibilities, I mean, are endless, and they're frightening. Look, it gives more exposure to deviance. And I can't remember the doctor's name, but I brought up a good point. I think it was Dr. Dobson, I believe, that interviewed Ted Bundy. And one of the things that he pointed out was, if you look at back in the day, you didn't really pick. You could turn the channel. Maybe you had 3 or 4 channels on what you can watch. But today, you could get whatever you want. So the possibilities are limitless. And when you talk about pornography, it just adds that extra dimension of exposure. So he brought up the movie E.T., the extraterrestrial. And do you remember what the extraterrestrial was given by Elliot? And it was, those of you who haven't seen the E.T., hate to play spoiler, but it was Reese's Pieces.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was a 15-second clip. And Reese's Pieces was the #1 selling candy in the entire world at that time.
Wow.
So when you look at, again, something such as this, that, it's frightening. Go back to what Dean, talked about rehearsal, honing your craft. So you have the ability to do that. And it's very difficult. It's as far as taking that and committing and engaging in criminality, going back what the doctor was also talking about, that it's you don't know who the individual is or what's going on in their life that could put them over the edge. And Greg, you were mentioning that you just don't know. You don't know what's going on in that individual's life and where they're at. And usually when you talk with when you talk to folks that have done bad things, there's usually some sort of stressful event that pushes them over the edge to make that decision to engage in that criminality. So we don't know where they're at the time when they engage with regards to the metaverse.
I guess my question for everybody is, in your experience, how often do you run across somebody who does do a sexual assault or sexual homicide that they have had nothing ever to do with pornography? So I think there's an aspect of this. It seems to always be there at the table. We can look at it from one side and say, well, tons of people are exposed to it. But the other side of it is that I don't think, at least what we're seeing at the foundation, when we get into sexual assaults and sexual homicides, it's part and parcel of that. And to me, that brings up this second word. We've talked about anonymity, but to me, there's another word, and that's familiarity. And I think what the metaverse enables, and this is both on the offender and the victim side, is it enables people to develop a level of familiarity that is not always based, oftentimes not even based in reality, but exposes them to a high risk.
Interesting. Dr. Burgess, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to add on to what Dina just said, is how many of those of us that work with either victims or offenders are asking if the person is engaged in the metaverse. I mean, that's something we need to really add to our questions, because we routinely do it on social media. What are you watching, what are the platforms, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to start now that after this, really see what people are doing in their activities. So that's what I recommend to both victims and for anyone that even my students, I might even ask them how many are using that. The other thing I would say is, where are they getting the content for these scenarios? And we should, I think that's, from a research standpoint, would be interesting to find out. I looked at some literature, some of the research literature, and there's starting to be some interesting articles there. And one was on content and how that content is built. And they had some real warnings that I think some of you have already mentioned some of those, but being too engaged in this can affect their own relationships, because they aren't able, they get the high from what is on the virtual, but not in the real relationship. So some of those factors are already coming into the literature.
Well, when I'm inquiring about the person's particular interests and sex and so forth, we do talk about any form of pornography, but we really, I do ask about the content of the pornography, because what is more concerning is not garden variety pornography, but pornography of a violent nature, bondage pornography, things like that. And again, there are many people who engage in these things that we don't see go on to commit violent offenses, but we do see people that where there can be a spillover. Even more disturbing, and we saw this with the introduction of the internet, there are also people on the other side of the sadomasochistic coin who desire to be wounded or injured by other people. And there have been horrendous cases of individuals who get together with an offender with a wish or a desire to be killed, tortured, so forth. So that you also have to worry about individuals that have a fantasy of being harmed, a fantasy of being injured, and so forth. And what worries me about the metaverse is the idea that a person feels that he or she can play out either sadistic or masochistic fantasies without really worrying that it's going to spill over into real life. And that's where I think you start treading a very, very dangerous line, because eventually, as those of us who've worked with offenders know, the spillover is a very real thing. But I think the emphasis has to be on like violent pornographic content. I'd love to hear other people's contents there, but I'll just point out that I once interviewed an offender who told me that as a little boy, he had been wandering around the neighborhood in an alley and found that in a garbage pail, somebody had thrown out two magazines. One of them was a kind of a Playboy magazine, and the other one was a kind of a, I guess I'd say, like a detective magazine, like one of these magazines where a knife is being held to a woman's throat, and it's a sort of true crime magazine and so forth. And he said that picking between them, he found the second one to be far more arousing. And I think, which just wouldn't surprise, I think, a lot of people that are here on the panel. So that I think there's a special emphasis on that type of sexual titillation that I think we have to pay attention to in interviews like Ann is talking about. Wouldn't you say, Ann?
Yeah, I would just say Bob Ressler, one of his famous interviews of a serial killer, brought in about a dozen detective magazines. And what he did is he went through with the person he was interviewing, who was a serial killer, just to ask him specifically what part of the cover. He showed him all these covers was particularly of interest to him. And it was all the bondage. And he was able to, it was almost like a Rorschach, that he was able to find out all this information about his, and it was just detective magazine. So you didn't have to have I think somebody else made that point. It doesn't have to be pornography. It can be anything that, and in this case, he had started on this early, around 7 or 8, when he was able to get the magazines.
What if Ted Bundy had access to the fuel available today? What are the potentials there? And what do you see in your research, in your interviews with these individuals? And I'll start with you, Dr. Simon. Where are they gaining the most access in terms of through their fantasy process?
Yeah, and I wouldn't have anything to add with regards to what Ann and Gary were talking about the assessing the pornography, and that's exactly words out of my mouth on that. But as far as the question,
what kind of red flags, right, for the average woman who may just get into gaming, and next thing you know, she's on the metaverse and she enters, a world of. I read one quick article that talked about one victim. She was in the metaverse for 30 seconds, and she immediately had 5 or 6 avatars groping her and trying to pull her into other rooms. So what kind of tools can we give this woman, if she's into gaming and she happens to be in these environments? What say you if you have your thought there?
Well, and I mean, obviously, to get out, whatever it is that to leave the situation, and maybe of course go a different route, a different game, or what have you. Not to subject anyone. No one wants to be subjected to that. Would have given someone like Bundy the opportunity to rehearse. Okay, whereas opposed to, because Bundy engaged in other types of criminality for what some would arguably would say was rehearsal. For example, hitting a young woman with a stick and running away just to observe their reaction, or telling jokes in front of women just to see what their reactions would be. So essentially, he's studying his victims in real time. So if you have the metaverse, he could go on there and he could study his victims. If a child, let's say if a kid's allowed to play a video game 2 or 3 hours a day, and then they find themselves playing 14 hours a day or 15 hours a day, that's an issue. So, you come in
all the time.
Huh?
It's happening all the time with kids. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we go back to that exposure. That means that child is being exposed 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times more than someone else. So it goes back to the number of exposures. And so
it's right. Greg, what were you going to say? I can tell you want to lean in here.
No, just to reemphasize we talk about how practice makes perfect. Well, it's not really practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice makes perfect. And this is a beautiful example of a forum that can allow for creating that perfect practice before going out to offend. But let me ask you, Chris, I mean, as an individual that's investigated over 300 homicides, you can share with us any example of cases that you've had where in any number of those instances when an individual had access to this potential, how that would have affected your job as an investigator, how it would have influenced your ability to solve that crime.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I am very concerned about what's on the horizon, right? And just knowing what was before. I mean, we were we were part of that early on, when the internet showed up, right? 93, 95. And everybody went, what's the internet? And remember, you have to type in DOS back in the day.
Yeah.
And so this is like the internet. I don't think this is anything that, and I'm grateful the three docs are here because, this is their lane in yourself, where I think we're in new territory here that is, because it's going to hit the school systems. We're going to have kids in school, going through virtual learning. And then what does that expose them to in relationship to their victimology? How does that, fall into play for the Wesley Dodds of the world, right? Docs. I mean, and, how does that play into his play? And that's what is really concerning for me. So from an investigative aspect, I think we're going to have to learn what exactly, is going to be the behavioral type, what kind of personality is going to present itself in these worlds, and kind of listen to the victims, unfortunately, to kind of get a baseline on where this stuff is going to go. So I think it's going to be an interesting next 10, 15 years. Doc Burgess, starting your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that there's going to have to be I think we've got to find out where this is going. It's going to, I'm sure, hit the young people. And if it's going to be like the internet, where the parents and older people were the last ones to get on board, it was the young people that's really took over with the internet. I wonder if that's going to be the same way with this.
Interesting.
So, yeah, we need to really have, I think, a better handle on who's doing this. Do they have to have the headgear to do this? I mean, will that be that? If that's so, that makes it a little bit easier because people could see the headgear.
People to do situational awareness, but could those be applicable for someone who finds himself in the metaverse, at least as a starting point?
You mean using it in a more legitimate fashion?
Yeah, I mean, in other words, the questions that we teach people to ask themselves in the physical world, they should be asking those same questions, I would think, in a metaverse, right?
Sure.
Aren't they all applicable?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg. Thoughts?
No, not at all. I think there are ways that certainly law enforcement can utilize this as a tool in crime prevention, for example, right? And we can use it in very legitimate ways. With respect to victimology, we try to teach for the civilian side of the house that there are basically three questions one can ask themselves to make a determination as to their potential risk level in a situation, environment, or circumstances. And that is, what am I doing? Who am I with? And where am I?